a few words to all of them about what class you've signed up for, this class called Gastronomy. It's a class about the sort of the culture of food, sociology, philosophy, theology of food, as well as we get to do a fair bit of practicing in this class of actually cooking. And so we've been working through a number of different books over the past weeks, the Supper of the Lamb, and last week we did the book In Tune with the World, A Theory of Festivity by Joseph Piefer. And this week we're beginning the work called, you can see here the title here, American Cuisine by Paul Friedman, which is about that it's a sort of a social history of American food and what has formed American tastes. It's really fascinating, very fascinating story. The American food scene is a really interesting historical development. And so this is a kind of a journey through that up to present time, helping us to understand why our culture's attitudes toward foods are the way they are on a number of different fronts, as well as why we eat the way that we do, the certain kinds of foods that we that are prolific, and why our food culture is unique and different in many ways than a lot of other food cultures. So that's what we're doing today. And the purpose of the class really is to explore the significance of eating from a Christian perspective, and to see its ramifications across our lives in terms of, as we saw last week when we talked about In Tune with the World, we talked about the theological basis for understanding what festivity is all about and why cultures celebrate, and why we celebrate in a way that is not just simply taking time away like a weekend from work, but actually seeing our Sabbath, the Sabbath rest that the Lord has given, as a way of delighting and rejoicing in the goodness of our being and of the world's being. And that's what is the sort of theological foundation for festivity. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. We might talk a bit more about that as we review last week's class and as we talk about what's to come. Glad to have you all a part of this. If you're coming from various different places, really glad to have you watch in on our NSA classes, albeit how unusual they are right now. It's not normal that we're gathered this way, but it gives a wonderful opportunity for others to gather with us in a way that would otherwise not be possible. So as we find in our discussion of the food system today, there are always pluses and minuses, advantages and disadvantages for the way things are. And so we can be thankful for what we have to work with today. Well, I think we're all here. Hello, Caleb. Good to see you. Hannah, good to see you as well. And Anna, good to see you, although darkly. All right. Well, as before we begin here, why don't we ask the Lord to bless us, and let's pause to pray to him. Father, thank you for this day, and especially, Father, for this season. Much of what we have been talking about last week and understanding what festivity is all about is so appropriate during this season where we've celebrated Easter and are in the midst of celebrating Easter. I pray that our discussion today would illumine the way that you have made us, and give us the ability to see with wisdom how you have made the world and how we should order our lives in it. Thank you for the opportunity to rejoice, share this time with one another, even though we are not able at this moment to be in each other's presence. I thank you for this technology that enables us to meet in this way. Thank you for all those who are joining us today, and I pray you would bless them as well. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, very good. Good to see you all. I hope that your Easter celebrations were informed by the course that you've been going through. I hope that all the things we've been reading were a blessing to you in celebrating. I'd love to hear, just as a way of opening a little bit, about how your Easter celebrations were. What did you all eat? What did you have? What great things were a part of your day yesterday? Anyone to?
I was at the Edwards' house, so we had this beautiful, it was amazing 3-course meal. So we started off with sort of like a quiche with goat's cheese and whole garlic cloves, actually, which I thought was interesting because I wasn't sure how that was going to turn out, but it tasted beautiful. And then the main was a smoked brisket, I think it was, smoked beef brisket, which was really good. And they did the mashed potatoes with they'd boiled the marrow from, I'm not sure which, I think it was the cow, because they ordered the whole cow in or something a few months back, as they boiled the bones and got the marrow from the bones and put them into the sweet potato, into the mashed potatoes, and then various veggies, and then sticky toffee pudding. So it was amazing.
Sounds fantastic. Anyone else?
Well, Megan and I pretty much just ate all throughout the day to make up for the fact that we couldn't do as much with other people.
Very good.
We had like a big breakfast in the morning, like waffles, eggs, and bacon, and then like cheese board, lunch in the park for lunch, and then our big dinner that was in the evening, and Megan did a pot roast and veggies and bread, and then lemon meringue pie afterwards.
Wonderful.
It was amazing.
That sounds amazing. Anyone else?
I cooked lamb for the first time.
How did that go?
It was really good. We didn't have much of it. We bought very small portions of it, but I made a gravy out of it with some, like there were leftover juices from it and some wine, and it was so good. And we had it with some balsamic carrots and cranberry goat cheese, Brussels sprouts, and mashed potatoes, and it was very good. Yeah, it was. Yeah, I was really surprised just how flavorful the gravy really was doing it like that.
Excellent. That's awesome. Well done. That's great. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about what we had. I got a prime rib and aged it for 4 days in the refrigerator before cooking it yesterday. And I'll tell you that I think that was the perfect amount of time it was about 8 pounds. So it wasn't a huge roast, but it was just the right amount of time. The flavors really got concentrated, and the meat, the action that we, discussed when we were, have we talked about dry aging yet, or am I just imagining that we have? We have, I thought so. Okay. So we talked about that previously, and it was really true. The enzymes which break down the meat through the dry aging process just made it so tender. And I cooked it a little bit beyond what I normally like, which is medium rare, into the medium range. And yet still, the meat was so tender and flavorful that beefiness gets really concentrated. My children told me it was the best prime rib I have ever cooked yet. So that was a triumph. I was glad to hear that. We served it with a creme fraiche horseradish sauce, Parmesan orzo, gratin potatoes, asparagus, strawberry salad, and then we had a cheese plate at the beginning as well, and then we did carrot cake for dessert. So it was a very nice day, really fun. Again, I love the fact that I've been teaching this class. I hope all of you have enjoyed going through it. I wondered if you went through the experience noticing more flavors. Did you pay attention to the food more than you have maybe in the past as the result of going through what we've done? I know I certainly do. It always highlights and makes me pay attention to what we're eating and then the celebration surrounding it. So yeah, it was a really wonderful day, even though it was less filled with people than it typically is for us. So it was a smaller crowd this last Sunday. Well, very good. I wondered if there's anything that you want to share with the class about from our reading in Harold McGee on food and cooking, anything you want to observe or that you thought was particularly interesting for this week.
I did have sort of a question
Yeah.
actually on because I've started practicing some bread
Yes.
and I've never made bread before. And so when he talked about in the section on bread about how you know when it's finished rising is when you sort of poke it, and if it doesn't, the hole stays there, basically shows that it's sort of finished.
Yeah.
How long can you leave it for? Can you leave it longer after that, or does it? Because one recipe that I looked at said you can leave it in there for 2 to 3 days,
Mm-hmm.
and it will just be happy in the fridge.
Yeah, in fact, I think, especially in the fridge, what you do when you put it in the fridge is it slows down the process. So if you get it to the place where it has risen, and then you punch it down, put it in the fridge, you're going to be able to preserve it in that state, given the coldness of being in there. So I think that's actually one of the great advantages of refrigeration, is it has the ability to enable you to do something advanced, like proof cinnamon rolls, get the dough ready, put it in the fridge, then pull it back out, give it another proof, or allow it a little bit of time to recover its shape, and then put it in the oven. So yes, that the refrigeration is actually has a great deal of advantage.
Okay.
Anyone else?
I noticed the small section on bulgur wheat while I was reading, being like somehow it's like sliced or something and like parboiled, so that when you cook it later, it just cooks faster and it has a different texture. And I noticed it because I was actually looking for it all over the place this week. I had it in a salad that I was making this week, and I couldn't find it at Winco or Walmart. I had to go to the co-op to find some, and I had a tabbouleh salad that has bulgur wheat in it for Passover, and I'm used to having it every year, but I just don't make it very often. So I was kind of surprised when I saw it, bulgur wheat, in the book, and I didn't know how it was prepared beforehand and what made it different. I just thought it was a different kind of wheat. So I thought that was really cool to read.
Yeah, that's great. So what's the significance of gluten in wheat? What does it do?
Well, it allows for structure in bread, because that's what's actually going to, let it trap air and actually let it rise and hold its shape together.
Yep, exactly. It's what actually causes bread to have that ability to rise, and when it's baked, actually assume that beautiful, that lofty character. If you didn't have wheat, or if you don't have gluten, if you use really low gluten flour, it becomes a much more challenge to actually make it so that the bread will achieve the nice risen quality that we appreciate with bread. So gluten has this truly tremendous capacity. One of the interesting things that you may not know is that gluten content has so risen in modern flours that it now is like 50 times greater in white flour than it was, many years ago, when before we had the ability to select for it in breeding. And the result is, I think that we have flours that really are quite amazing in their ability to rise, and pastry flours and so forth, but they also have an extraordinarily high gluten content, which is a part of the perennial debate about why it is that gluten allergies seem to be part of our culture at this particular moment. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not that is part of the reason, but it's certainly true that gluten is a bigger part of flour, because for precisely that reason, its ability to make really luscious doughs and beautiful loaves of bread that come from that ability to capture the gases that are released from the yeast sugar reaction and actually make the dough rise. So, and again, I'm just say from last Tuesday's work, the bread that you guys did make, I was really impressed by how well the breads came out. They're not easy to do, and you guys really, the few of you that made bread last week, really did an excellent job. It was very well proofed, developed, and the loaves were beautiful. Had that beautiful nap inside, and that nap is that ability of the to have that kind of spongy elasticity in the center of the bread, while you have the nice crust on the outside. And you, several of you achieved that on your first try, which I thought was just spectacular. So you're to be commended for doing that. Bread baking is an art. I would recommend that, just as a way of dropping a little bit of a recommendation here, if you're interested in baking particularly, you really need to read The Bread Baker's Apprentice by Peter Reinhardt. And it's a phenomenal book. That Peter Reinhardt is a world-class baker. He was a Catholic monk for a while, and he's a baker of bread. And that book is just a phenomenal tutorial on how to make bread and how to bake and how to make dough and understand it really well, so that your breads come out not just perfect every time, but you really understand the process of how bread works. So the Bread Baker's Apprentice by Peter Reinhardt, if you're interested, pick it up. It's a beautiful book too, but really a fantastic education in baking. Okay, well, I think then what we'll do is, just by way of moving to the main entree for today, so to speak, we want to look then at maybe just before we dive right into American cuisine today and talk about, yes, this is going to be our mainly what we do. I want to just spend, if there's any time, spend just a little bit of time here talking about our reading from last week, just summarizing some of the main points and reminding ourselves of the theory of festivity that we talked about last Monday. Anything that you want to share that comes away, that you came particularly away from reading that book?
I thought it was a really good read for the current season, both in life and in the year, because it's kind of talking about what it means to celebrate and how you can have celebration even in the midst of suffering. So I don't know, I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was the kind of thing that really couldn't have been better placed, because it was, what does it mean really to celebrate, even in times that I think that a non-Christian wouldn't understand celebration.
Very good. And just say a word more about that, Hannah. Just develop that a little bit. The combination of why festivity can even be in a time when, for instance, there might be a plague. I was thinking of this shortly after we studied this. I don't know if any of you saw it, but Dr. Schlecht came out with a little video on celebrating Easter in a time of plague. And it was a kind of a historical reflection on some letters that were written by a couple of early Christian bishops on the time of celebrating Easter in the midst of a plague that was going through the land. And of course, one of the things that was established early on in Christian history is that the bishop would in fact write a Easter letter announcing the date of which Easter was affixed, but then also giving a little pastoral exhortation to the churches about the celebration of Easter. And this particular year, when the plague was going, the question was whether it was appropriate to celebrate Easter in the midst of a season where many people were dying, and where there was, in fact, a plague afoot, and they were meditating theologically upon the appropriateness. Should we just cancel Easter, or should we just set aside the festivity because there is all of this sorrow? And it was interesting that the bishops both argued that no, one should not give up celebrating Easter, because it was appropriate even in the midst of this to celebrate the festival of Christ's resurrection. And it was surprising to me how closely the reasons lined up with what we had read last week in Piefer's book. So anyway, I think it would be good to just maybe say a word or two about that if you can.
I mean, I think part of what I was thinking about is, how he's saying that the reason that we celebrate things is ultimately recognizing the God-givenness of them and the goodness of them, and recognizing that in human life, even though there is bitterness it can serve to contrast and bring out the sweetness of life as opposed to just sort of null it. And if you only believe in celebrating as sort of a, a way of just dealing with life, then maybe it would seem insulting to, celebrate during hardship. But if you believe that ultimately life is joy, that ultimately at the bottom of things is God's love, then even in the midst of present suffering, you can see that it's not that you're sort of ignoring reality, it's you're hearkening to a greater reality. And I think that's kind of what I was thinking about in Easter this week, that, it's not that we're ignoring the current situation. We're actually seeing it for what it truly is and in its true context, as something that serves to highlight ultimately God's love and his provision, as opposed to something that detracts from it.
I love it. That's really beautiful and well said too, the way that you put it. I think you're exactly right. That was what these bishops were articulating as well. It reminded me of what Piefer said, that no martyr curses the world, because even in going to his cross, he's acknowledging that there is beauty and goodness about the way that God has made the world. And that's the true source of what festivity is rejoicing in. I love the way you put it when you said, we don't just celebrate as a diversion, as a way of getting away from reality. The whole point of festivity, as Piefer's talking about it, is that it's entrance into reality. And that's not ignoring suffering or pain, but it's an acknowledgement that suffering and pain are an aberration of God's original good creation. That's the nature of our being and of the world. And in fact, the celebration of Easter is an entering into the reality that God has remade the world in the suffering of Christ, taking on the suffering of the world on himself, and by so doing, restoring and establishing a new creation, so that now, in Jesus, every man is new creation. And that means that the answer to death has a second powerful answer, in which God has restored the goodness of creation, vindicated it, and not let evil mar his world as the last word. Now, life, rather than death, is the word of creation. And so the martyr can, and even these bishops said, the celebration of Easter can be a great consolation in the midst of plague, because it is reminding us that the plague, or the evil that we currently experience, is not the last word. It's not the word that is ultimately orienting. The fact is that life and goodness and the vindication of the world, because of God's goodness in making it, and then his goodness in redeeming it and restoring it, is what we are celebrating. And that means it's not an escape. It's an entrance into the reality that is deeper than the reality of the pain and the suffering, and gives that pain and suffering meaning and coherence. There is a deeper reality still yet that festivity acknowledges and celebrates. So that was exactly what an appropriate time to be studying this. I think actually, I had obviously no idea when I established the syllabus that we would be reading that book at this particular moment. I probably should have realized that it was right around Easter that we'd be reading it, but this context and circumstances of this Easter, I could never have predicted a few short weeks ago. So the Lord, in his kindness, gave us a book, I think, that was really helpful for understanding how to celebrate in the midst of this current moment. I was really grateful for that. So well said, Hannah. That was really well said. Any other add-ons, thoughts about that?
One thing that's coming to mind is really, I think, insightful distinction between ordinary days of the week being devoted to servile arts versus festival days being devoted to liberal arts. So servile arts not being something bad, but the work we do for an end, the work we do to support ourselves, and that's not bad, but we're doing work for another end, whereas festival days are about doing things for the enjoyment of the thing itself, or loving things in and of themselves without an end. And it was really cool to see how well that complemented with Capon, and like, you know, his line that like one real thing is closer to God in all the diagrams of the world, and how much Capon is talking about like just love the things as it are, as things as they are before you move to what can I do with this.
Right.
Then a little extra thing, I happened to be reading That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis this week, and which like actually dovetailed into both of those really nicely at one moment, where it's kind of like a key turning point for one of the characters, who's always like his entire life just been trying to like be a social advancer and like always try to get into like the next, be in the group. And he's realized through his entire life he's been doing it. One of like the key turning points in his narrative is realizing that he's never enjoyed anything for itself. And like that's one of the like turning points, is when he realizes that he's always been using people and things to try to get into some, you know, new social status, rather than enjoying the person or the thing for itself. And like, so I found that really cool. It's like been all these different angles have been coming in, and we get the philosophic angle and like Capon and then a bit of Lewis, all saying the same thing in like different forms.
Yes. Yeah, that's beautiful. You know, it reminds me of, I was thinking it might be appropriate for us to read just as way of maybe one Sunday or Sabbath, just as a form of enjoyment, as Lewis's essay on the inner ring, which is all about that quest, Caleb, that you're talking about, that sense of using things in order to achieve some inner purpose, and how that is, for Lewis, really a pathway to hell. The quest to find the inner ring and be a part of the inner ring, and rather than actually resting and rejoicing in the goodness of what God has made. I think it's significant that I was thinking of the fact that really that is, Piefer is saying that's really what the Sabbath is all about. That's why God gave us one day in 7 to rest. And part of that rest is actually learning to rejoice and delight in the things as they are, including God himself for who he is and what he has done and made in the day set aside for that, and also rejoicing in the things that God has made. And obviously that's one day in 7 is a very important, like it's almost as if the Lord knew we would forget these things, that we would, part of sin's influence on us is to be people relentlessly driven by a kind of utility, a view of utility, with ourselves at the center of it. What can be useful to me? And the Sabbath bids us cease from all of that and actually enter into the rest of delight that God has made over his whole creation. Now, if you think about the Sabbath when God rested, again, the point being that God didn't need to rest. He was not exhausted and therefore needed to rest. That rest was a fullness of delight and rejoicing and gladness in the goodness of the things that he had made. God saw that it was very good. And God rested from his work and delighted in that. And, you know, there is an analogy of that in our creative ability as well. You know what it's like when you're done with something. It might be a crafting project, or it might be some, tilling of earth and creating your own garden, or a project that you've done, and you step back and you admire it and you look at it and you appreciate it for what it is. And you say, wow, that really looks good. I used to build furniture with my brother for a living. And there was always that moment when you were done with a particular piece of furniture, and it would be sitting there and you applied the last coat of finish and you buffed it all out and it just looked beautiful. And I remember the satisfaction, one of the satisfactions of that is sometimes hard to come by in information professions, but the ability to step back and survey the thing that you had made and say, it's good, it looks good, and I made that thing, and I'm sort of rejoicing in its being and what it is, and there is a real delight and enjoyment in that process. I think we enjoy that because that is we're made in God's image, and that's what God did on the 7th day of rest. So really well said too, Caleb. I love that contrast between the servile arts and the liberal arts. and the freeness of the liberal arts, which is so often lost in our very utilitarian age, where we think so much pragmatically about nearly every aspect of our life. And the liberal arts remind us that at the heart of what God has done in making the world is this kind of liberty, that it is good in its being. It isn't just good to what use we can provide. The goodness is there before we provide any use for it at all. I like to say this with my kids, that there are fish in the deepest part of the ocean that no man has ever seen, and God just still delights in them. They're down there because he thought it was a good thing, and he still observes them and rejoices them. They're not being utilized by people for anything. And yet they are there hanging out in the darkness, doing their thing, just as God made them to be. Hannah, you said you see the same thing in The Lord of the Rings. I'm curious if you might just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I've been reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time with Dr. Mack's little reading club and listening to his lectures on them. And really the theme you see again and again is that the ring is all about using others and being something that is like it's sort of this embodiment of technology. It is all about getting ends and means, and that's always opposed to the good characters who sort of just exist for their own sake. And you really see that with like Tom Bombadil, who just kind of exists in his own world and is just there, and he doesn't really serve a purpose in the story except for to be himself. So it's really Tolkien. It makes sense, a similar theme that Lewis has, where it's all about, are you loving something for itself and for the being that it is, or are you trying to constantly get things to be what you need them to be so you can get to your own end? And you really see that with like Saruman, who's all about getting what he wants, regardless of what it destroys in the meanwhile.
And one of the things that we now, to sort of make the transition to the book that we read for this particular week, I was pondering what you just mentioned, Hannah, as I was reading through this, and again making one of the things that he notes that I find one of the most fascinating things about this particular book, and just about our country in general, is the rise of how industrialization shaped and molded our culture in so many ways, not just in food, other ways too, but dramatically in our food culture. And one of the statistics, I don't know if you found this striking, it was really striking to me though, as I was watching, it was in chapter 4 when he was talking about how the Industrial Revolution really did change Americans' relationship to the land. So he talked about the fact that with industrialization, we had this realm of plenty, that industrialization was really quite significant in making food much more prolific, existing in much larger quantities. In fact, the result of that caused food costs to go down, where the American budget went from 30 or 40% devoted to food to being down to around 12%, which is what most modern Americans spend of their household budget on food, 12%. I think ours is a little higher than that, but nevertheless, a lot of that's sort of the statistical average, as they say. But what was even more striking, I thought, was at the beginning of I might just read a paragraph from here on page 140. Actually, it flips over to the top of 141. What we eat is radically cheaper than in the past when calculated as a percentage of household expenditures. In 1900, more than 40% of an average family's income was spent on food. And in 1950, the figure was 30%. In 2016, it was 12.6%, which is actually not the lowest it has been. And despite all the justified lamentation about obesity, type 2 diabetes, and circulatory diseases brought about by highly processed and fast foods, life expectancy has increased from 49 in 1900 to 78 today. Then the next paragraph. The percentage of people engaged in agriculture has fallen so that now it employs less than 1% of the population. Less than 1% of the population. That was actually, it was I think in the next chapter, chapter 5. Let me get to the place where I had the statistics here. They had a beautiful little chart. Let me see if I can find it here. Yes, in 1750, okay, 1750, this is on page 157. 1750, 75% to 80% of industry was devoted to, the labor force was devoted to agriculture, okay? 75% to 80% in 1750. By the time we get to 1900, it's at 40%. And by the time we get to 2013, it is 0.67% of the population is devoted to the production of food. Now, there's a lot to talk about with regard to that number and what it exactly means. But what are some of the things that immediately stand out to you? Obviously, I told you today at the beginning of class that so much of this middle section of the book is all about costs and advantages, the trade-off of costs, right? What things are advantageous on the one hand, but costly on the other. So just even thinking about that particular number, that one statistic, 0.67% of people are involved in the production of food in our current time. Let's think about some of the advantageous nature of that number, and then also what that might mean on the other side. What is that? What else does that represent? I'm just curious about your thoughts on that particular. I have my own thoughts, and we'll get to those in a little bit. But I'm just curious, given everything that we've read so far, what do you think? What are some of the ramifications? Yeah, Darcy, go ahead.
One advantage that was named in the book was reliability. Knowing that you can go to the store and always find Oreos. Like they'll always have them no matter what store you go to. It's a recognized brand, and you know they'll taste the same. So that kind of stability, and knowing that those kinds of things will always be there. Mm-hmm.
Now, I bet, I'm just curious, your generation may not have actually seen or see that in the food system as an actual, a sort of an advantage, right? We are, in this particular moment, very much interested in diversity and in new sort of products, things that are outside the mainstream, the Oreos and the Budweisers and everything else that's standardized and been this way. We all want the artisanal, the crafted, the handmade, all the rest of those things that are going on in this particular moment. But isn't it interesting that at the rise of industrialization, he argues, it was actually the opposite. People were really looking for a kind of stability, a kind of homogeneity, more predictability about their life. So that was actually a quality that they valued at that moment. It's not something we particularly value right now as much because it's so taken for granted. What else? That's a good thought.
I feel like another advantage, and he talked a lot about time,
Mm-hmm.
but less people being devoted to this because you have more like machinery and more industrialization. You get more people doing different things, focusing on maybe their social life or different types of jobs. So you cut down on time a lot for certain people. Sure. So I think that's actually disadvantage in the long run, but I think initially that looks like an advantage.
Okay, yes. And you saw that also as the book articulated the advertising campaigns and slogans that were designed to kind of sell these products to the American populace, particularly to the American housewife, right? And the the way that products were actually portrayed to her. Anyone want to comment on that from the book? What kinds of things did it try to convince the housewife of?
I tried to convince her that her husband would not like her unless she made food a certain way, gave food prep enough time, but not too much time. Mm-hmm. And then I think also in the 20s, there was this shift from the housewife looking like a motherly type to a more shapely figured woman who was fun. So she could do it both. She could cook and do the laundry, but also be a fun spouse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he had that one very memorable line. I wonder if you're thinking of this, where he said that it was, get to the 1950s and people are unlikely to ask a woman how she can cook. She's rather looking for someone, whether she is going to have fun, right? Whether she's going to, not so much what the productivity of her life in the home is like, but more is she able to enter into this kind of enjoyment and entertainment? Is she interested in sports, other things, that sort of thing? Oh, what that's again, you think about, I'm just, all the time I read this, I was thinking and just pondering at, just different eras of American history. But I think, you read to your, my kids are at this age where they're reading and hearing about, Farmer Boy, and from Laura Ingalls Wilder, and the, Almanzo's mom and his sisters had a very different, perspective on the world in their life than the 1950s housewife. You see that? What are some of the differences?
Well, from what I remember about Farmer Boy, and that what you're getting at,
Yeah.
at least, is like so much of their life is defined by productivity, and
Yes.
and that's just making things, making food. The whole life of their whole family is all involved in their common life, and that kind of just defines their whole day and whole season experience is the common work. Yeah.
Put it in a kind of modern parlance. Their whole life is artisanal. That is what Farmer Boy and his Almanzo, his father, and they're making things by hand, furniture wise, harnesses, breaking horses, all of the harvesting and planting and all the rest that goes into that. And Almanzo's mother and sisters are constantly putting up all the food that they have grown, and then making meal after meal, not only to feed the men in their work, but also doing all kinds of things in which they are, creating products to be sold. And so there's there's just a hearty economic center at the heart of this, of the household. By the time you get to go ahead, Hannah, what were you gonna say?
It seems like you could almost say that for them, life was productivity. It was just what life was that, wherein in the 50s, it becomes more like life is something outside of productivity. Like once you've checked off all the little productive boxes, you can go do things that are like life, that are experience.
Mm-hmm. But you're exactly right. I do think, though, that there's another point to be made. And this is, I don't know how many of you have read The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, kind of the sort of one of the early works. I'd have to remember what the date is of the work. I think it's in the 1950s. I'd have to just check to make sure that I have that right. But it's one of the early works of feminism in American the American experience in the 50s. And she is arguing, it's really interesting read, because it's not like there's a very different sort of argument in many ways than modern feminists are advancing. But one of the things that Friedan argues and shows is that women really don't, 1963, okay, yeah, so I knew it was close to the 50s, just kind of in the aftermath of the 50s, really writing. But she objects to the fact that women basically have nothing to do at home. That's a simplification of her argument, and you need to read the book for yourself to see how she develops that. But it's a woman just, the stereotype of the woman who walks around in her house in high heels, you know, tidying things up and bringing her husband his slippers when he comes home, and you know, making dinner and so forth. It made, and then attending, you know, whist, or not whist, but card game parties during the daytime, and all of those sorts of things, was really the way a woman was. She just didn't have, she had no meaning and no purpose in that particular location. And there's something, I think, very, you know, for Dan, is of noting something about a woman's place in the 1950s, which is a real departure from what the home used to be. And there are a number of books that document this. I would put, Alan Carlson has a wonderful book from oh my goodness, I just had it in my head and now it just fell out of my head. From factory to, I'm going to have to look it up. I'll get back to you in a moment with it, or maybe it will come to me. But it's all about the transition from the home as being a workstation, a place where work was done, and the family gathered, and it was an economic center, to really that work being outsourced to factories and other places, and the home really not being an industrial, a center of the economy in that kind of way. And as that work got outsourced, then the place and the meaning of the home really changed, due to the nature of each individual's relationship to productivity. It was not something centered in the home, it was something outside of the home. And that was one of the many consequences of industrialization, so forth. So again, back to the original question of that 0.67% that we noted. I was interested, Anna, in your comments. You noted that it's, you know, there's an advantage to having more time on your hands, but there can also be downsides to having a lot of time on your hands too. Interestingly, I was watching with my family a Julia Child's series, The French Chef, which she began in the 1960s, and we were watching some of the first episodes of that series. It's kind of, she's in her, I think they're making the episodes in her garage that has been outfitted with a kitchen, and it's very, not super high-end video by any stretch. But the thing that comes across in just a palpable way watching Julia Child cook is the joy in cooking that she has. She does not like all of the gadgets and the gizmos that kitchens get obsessed with, all the sort of labor-saving devices that the Industrial Revolution had produced to make cooking easier. She totally rejects those things and says, what you need to see is that cooking is not this tedious exercise that you have to get done in order to have food on the table. It itself is a delight, and there's skill involved, and the cooking of food is its own reward. It's like the craftsman's work. You can imagine a furniture maker basically finding only meaning in his work because of the use to which his desk is put at the end, not in the actual the craftsman-like process of making the desk in the first place, and seeing it as the piece of work that it is. That's the way Julia Child approached cooking. It's meaningful in and of itself to cook. It's a craft, shortcuts, pre-processed food, all that stuff. That's not what, you don't want all of that stuff. That makes it seem like this is just a utilitarian enterprise. She took all the sort of techniques that she learned in France, the standard repertoire of culinary techniques, and taught American, not just housewives, but men too. She wanted her show to be broadcast when men and women would both see it. And it was rejoicing in real food made as a craft and served in the context. So it always ended, her episodes always end with her putting food on the table and setting the table and getting ready to have this meal where everyone comes to sit down and enjoy. And she's in her inimitable Julia Child way, she throws food around. She takes chickens and smashes, takes her knife and hacks away and does all this stuff that you think, wow, she just is unabashed in her joyfulness of cooking. which was a real attitudinal change at that time. All that had been sort of broadcast is that cooking was drudgery. It was something to be gotten away from. As minimal time as possible spent doing it was better. And the more you could save time by getting all of these devices and also all this canned food and other things that were already prepackaged, it would be far easier and better to do. Julia Child came along and said, "Phooey on all that. That is the wrong way to look at food." So Julia Child's argument was, no, it's not actually better to have a bunch of time. It's better to spend a lot of time making a big pot of stock and using it and having great food. That's the way you should use your time. But it's interesting that for so long, you're exactly right, Anna, the system, the way food was and advertising went was that it would free up a woman to devote herself to other things. And that was a very powerful message in many ways. Okay, very good. Any other observations? Yes, Anna.
I thought it was interesting, especially that last note, sort of connecting it with like Marx's critique of capitalism, and I think especially more modern, even more so than in Marx's day, what a lot of modern people around my age have a lot of dislike of sort of what they call capitalism. And by that, they really mean jobs that give them free time, but don't feel like they have any inherent productivity. Like it seems like we have this yearning to do work that is actually profitable and that we actually see the ramifications of it, where it's not just sort of this abstract thing that we go, then we come back to our homes at our leisure. We want that connection and we crave it. So I think you could even tie it into people's sort of critique of what they call capitalism and interest in like a more Marxist way of looking at the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Luke, go ahead.
Going back to the huge drop in the number of people engaged in agriculture, at the top of page 142, he has this interesting note, which kind of goes back to stuff we've talked about before. He says, the distance between the producer and consumer has become so great that individuals have no idea where their food comes from. And even food producers and processors often merely assemble ingredients from global suppliers about whose practices they are conveniently ignorant. Mm-hmm. And so this sort of goes back to our conversation, was it Wisbert, I think, that we were talking about, and the idea of the gardener and how, let alone the fact that this period of time that he's talking about, people not only do they not know how to cook, they don't even know where any of their food is coming from, because the increasing the number of people who are not working in agriculture then means that no one knows where any food is coming from, really.
Yes, that's very important. One of the things that immediately occurred to me is, in line with what you're saying, Luke, is if only 0.67% of people are actually engaged in the husbandry of growing food. You remember that whole chapter on gardening and his reflections on the fact that man was made, first task given, to be a gardener.
Yeah.
What is the significance of man being a gardener and fulfilling that initial task given to him by the Lord?
He is like the primary function of that was to obviously cultivate the garden, and so it's a very close connection with the creation, the goodness of creation as God gave it to us and said, make this better, make this more beautiful, make this more glorious. And so if that's interesting to think about, if the number of people who don't even have hands-on personal experience of what that's like, what that feels like, the difficulty that's involved in that, the patience that cultivates, all the trial and error, all the difficulty surrounding that. Most people today have no idea what even that closeness to that creation and that cultivation is like.
Yes, that's the thing that struck me. If you think about that as man's original task given to him by the Lord, and not just like God didn't intend every man just to be a farmer. Okay, that I'm not suggesting that, but that there's something deeply connected to man's being about the task to cultivate the earth, not just in gardening, but across the spheres of what man's involved with. If that's his main task given, and he is, not connected in a way, there's some really significant consequences I think you could spin out from that. But before we get to that, Priscilla, what were you going to say? I saw your hand up there.
Yeah, it seems like, if you're placed in a garden and you're a gardener and that's your purpose is to be the gardener. And if you take the garden away from the gardener, then he has no purpose. And I was thinking about the Latin word ars, which means like like skillfulness. As though if it used to mean skillfulness, but now it just means art. And it was a art is just the product of the skill. But if you're defining something as just the product, you're taking the skill out of it.
Yes, that's very good. I think that's really true. Taking the skill out of the product, but also I was thinking of the fact that there's so many ways that this argument for labor-saving devices. I think the way Anna was speaking about it, I'm curious, Anna, for your thoughts about this sort of. You mentioned there's the downside to having all this extra time, this being set free from having to do these things, and I think that's worth pondering a bit more, because it's not just here in the realm of food. There is a lot of arguments one could make for, this is the argument for the industrial food system, and it was really behind the government's design to design it this way, that productivity, getting as much out of the soil as possible, lowering the number of people who had to be involved in that industry, making it recession proof in a way by make the consequence of making it be highly productive meant that they had to also engage in monoculture, right? Monoculture is highly productive in the sense that you can get a massive amount more of food by planting one crop than having a farm devoted to many crops. But what's the downside of a monoculture arrangement? And I mean monoculture, that we could talk about monoculture in terms of the just agricultural monoculture. But if you think about monoculture, that stands for a lot of things, a philosophy of kind of dealing with life. It's not just about, what you plant in your field. What's this trouble with monoculture? Start with an agricultural perspective. Yeah, Luke, go ahead.
Just from a purely basic, I guess there's agricultural perspective. If you're just growing the same thing and you're not doing any crop rotation or different animals, this kind of thing, you have this, you're draining the soil and you're taking all the goodness out of the soil with the same crop over and over again. So you need to use probably artificial manure or pesticides, whatever it would be, to keep the same crop growing the same way, But then also you have the sort of the economic downside of that, which is if for any reason there's a blight on that crop and you lose that whole crop, then the whole farmer's he's lost all his livelihood.
That's exactly right. Whereas in older times, as he notes, when farms were much more polycultures, right, they had a lot of different crops. That would mean that in any particular given instance where you would have a particular blight of some variety, the farmer wouldn't lose his economic standing, because he would be able to provide for himself with the other crops that so economically there was an advantageous to that sort of polyculture. But it's interesting that the U.S. government, the reason why we have such monoculture in our country, is because it was subsidized by the U.S. government as a way of increasing efficiency, right? Increasing efficiency and making the biggest yield possible. The consequence, of course, economically, is that farmers now have to basically, those 0.67% of people involved in the industry have to have massive government subsidies in order to be able to continue the program of this dramatic this quest for efficiency. Because you're right, one bad season and they're destroyed, unless it is that they're propped up by government subsidies, so that they can, if in a time of too much wheat, for instance, they can be paid by the government to not grow that crop. But it's dramatically changed the face of American farmland. And so there's a benefit on one side, which is the increase of efficiency and the increase of productivity. Absolutely, can't argue with that, right? An acre of farmland yields far more due to genetically modified seeds and so forth, as well as industrial fertilizers and also efficiencies of growing, no question. But it also has come at a cost too. And that's the other side that's worth thinking about. There is real cost to making something as efficient as possible, right? That if that's the only thing that you're after, it reminds me of Capon's maxim, that one real thing is closer to God than all the diagrams of the world. If you think about his critique of the people who want to make food pills, take away food and just make it or his critique of dieting, which is that it's just about measuring food according to one measurement. Isn't it interesting that that whole framework is a kind of efficiency? It's a kind of one value. This is the most important thing. We need to have this be the thing. And the end result of that is that there are real consequences that come that you may not actually recognize. Okay. I was thinking about this in relationship to our own experience of education here at the moment, this online experience. Now, as you well know, I'm grateful that we have the opportunity to do this. This is far better than not having any school at all, right? But one might argue that on the basis of efficiency, if that was really the only thing that was really important, we could come away from our experience of being separated and think, hey, man, we just totally saved ourselves a ton of cost and problem by letting everyone go to their own place and be where they are and never have to come, live in each other's presence and go through the school experience and all the rest. Man, we'd save ourselves so much time and money and energy and all the rest by, in fact, just making this the way we carry on education from here on out. Do you think you could make an argument for that? Yeah, you could. And I think it's actually going to be an argument that is made greatly in the realm of higher education. That's a whole nother story, and there's a lot of interesting things regarding that. A lot of bloated inefficiencies and costs that are associated with higher education that are in need of some taming. And I think this particular moment is actually going to have an impact on that. Everyone's talking about that at the moment. But I think that the thing that I'm thinking about is NSA has actually said, and I think it's absolutely fundamentally right, you all know this, that if we were to do that, we were to say, hey, we've discovered this new way of doing this in which we increase the productivity so that, the costs go down, you save time, more opportunities are given to other things. What would you end up losing though? I'm just curious, what's the trade-off? You guys are all shaking. How do I even put that into words?
Yeah, where do we even start? I guess. Just the friendships that you make by being with people, times of camaraderie, more learning because you're rubbing shoulders with people who are more intelligent than you and they can give you help and you can help other people. And that's only a very small start.
Accountability in all areas of life.
Yeah, accountability. The ability to have people know you, right? And not just know you on a surface level, but actually know you in your weaknesses and know you in your strengths, know you inside and out, right? That you'd miss that. That would be, an unknown in this kind of arrangement. But one might argue, what do you really need that though? Is that really so you're paying an awful lot of money for that kind of experience? Is that really, and again, we're back to the ars liberalis, the arts, the arts servile, the servile arts. You're back to that distinction again, right? We could make an argument for efficiency and a certain degree of utility here, but that's not the most important thing in education. And if you idolize that and put it at the first place, you lose so much that is actually deeply essential to the task of education that is not actually on the syllabus. If all education is a download of information from me to you, then these little screens are fine. We've done our business and we've, and it's not like there isn't something going on here, right? But we all know, I was just talking with Dr. Smith about this the other day. I think the reason why the experience of doing this has gone well for these weeks that we've had to do it is that we all know each other. You know, we spent years working together, working in each other's presence, face to face, talking and discussing and knowing each other. And those relationships carried on in real time are now being now we're reaping the fruit of them here in these particular moments. So it is a real blessing and a benefit. But you could imagine if this is all we ever knew of each other, the little screen, little window here, if this was it, you could imagine this experience would be entirely a different experience altogether. I mean, so different as to not even be in the same universe of discourse, right? But just apply that same thought then to the fact that we have significantly reduced to almost vanishing a vanishing number of people actually involved in the cultivation of food in America. And I think that one could argue that has great utility. There is a great on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is also a tremendous cost that comes with that as well. If in fact part of what cultivation is all the things that Wurzba talks about, which is patience, the ability to understand that things have a being, and that you can't just enforce your will on them willy-nilly, feed them enough pesticides and fertilizer that they will bend to your will. And of course, I'm not against, just so you know, I'm not against pesticides and fertilizer. Those things are all from the history of mankind have been used in different ways. We take, cow poop and throw it on our plants and it grows. And we've been doing that since, I'm sure Adam did it after he when he was learning to cultivate. That's part of learning to cultivate the earth. It's true. But I think that what I'm just arguing here in terms of really understanding part of the rise of industrialization in America is that there are costs and there are benefits. And sometimes the costs and benefits can become so stark and polarized that we think of something as advantageous or beneficial that we can't actually see the possibility of doing any other way. Like we just assume this is the way it is. For us, it is normal that only 0.67% of people are actually involved in the act of growing food. And the outcome is that most people have not a lot of idea how food is actually brought about, how it ends up in our grocery stores. And I think just more than that, even just the connection to actually understanding, like when you go out to plant a garden, if you're a hobbyist and you think, okay, I really want to learn how plants go, you start doing it and you realize, man, this is harder than it seems. This is actually quite difficult. I think I'll leave it to the experts to grow my plants. I will admit we grow tomatoes almost every year in our little garden, and I'm not sure that in terms of efficiencies, if I actually grow tomatoes I'm sure I grow tomatoes that are much more expensive at the end of the day than the tomatoes I buy at the grocery store, right? And they require a fair bit of time and so forth. But it's easy to argue when you have that experience to say, well, I'm really glad I don't have to do this at all. And of course, there is benefit to division of labor. Absolutely, economies are built on division of labor. Absolutely, in terms of skill and so forth. But I think what he is talking about here in these chapters in the rise of the food culture of our time, part of that is actually there are significant costs that I think sometimes remain hidden in our particular moment to the fact that only a small percentage of people, we've moved from 80% of people being involved in food to 0.67% of people involved in food. And I think there are some interesting realities consequences behind that transformation. Any other thoughts along that line? I didn't want to miss anyone who might have something to say. Caleb, go ahead.
Yeah, going back to what you're talking about, subsidies and connecting to your conversation about efficiency, I've wondered before how much in our current situation of American industrialization, how much we need to argue against efficiency, because Okay, try to work out what I'm thinking. Often, a common conservative response to the critique of the industrialized food system is that we need this in order to like support society as we know it, support making a food for world populations as it is. But I'm wondering with the existence of government subsidies, of how much this system we have is actually dependent on that, and that I'm sure a lot of people who are saying this is just what we need, like conservatives who'd say this is just what we need, would not be supportive of government interference in the economy.
Right.
And so I'm wondering it's kind of hard to know, but to what extent is this system actually the most efficient? Because it's being propped up by external factors that aren't part of the economy. So I'm wondering if this was truly a free market, if farmers would realize, okay, like if I have a bad year, I'm going down, maybe I should plant something else. Like this is destroying my soil. Yep. In a couple of years, I won't be able to grow anything. Maybe I should plant something else. Like, I'm wondering if we didn't have these external factors, if we'd actually find it to be more efficient to farm in a different way.
Well, and that's such a difficult, you ask the $1 million question and you ask it well. The hard part about answering it is that you're talking about at one level a story that didn't get played out in a certain way. It's always mystified me at one level how conservatives have often made that very argument that you suggested, Caleb, about the fact that efficiency means that we have all this food and we're able to support the world and not just our hunger, but world hunger, and people have it better and people's lifespans have gotten longer. Absolutely all true. Absolutely. But what is somewhat ironic to it, from my way of thinking about it, is if you understand the history of how the American food system got to the way it is a story of socialism in many ways. The two biggest events, I think, are World War II and the Great Depression. And the outcome of that, and actually you saw one of the things, he just gestures to several small things, but big things, but in small ways. But the fact that the infrastructure of energy had to be created in order for farms to be productive, right? They had to have electricity. And that was a massive infrastructure of the government, and particularly here in the Northwest with all of our dams, for instance. I mean, if you take a look at a picture of Eastern Washington before Grand Coulee Dam and the dams, it's black at night, no lights at all. After the dams, same picture, and you see the ability to get water there, the ability of electricity to be able to utilize and harness for the purpose of agriculture. And so much of just on that level was the infrastructural side. But even more than that, all of the subsidies that were created, and that was the big, you saw Earl Butz, Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, had a dramatic impact of telling people, farmers had to get big or they had to get out of agriculture. And it was the America's farm policy that really encouraged the fence row to fence row form of farming, in which now in certain parts of America, in the heartland of America, if you don't grow corn or soybeans, the basically three major products, if you don't grow them, you can't actually, if you grew something else, there would be no one who would take your product and actually put it on the market and sell it, because all the grain warehouses and storage facilities and places where you sell grain, they only take those three products. That's it. And so you have to play by those rules. And that was engineered, definitely engineered. And so that's a very significant part of how our American food system has come. And has it had certain successes? Absolutely it has. It's interesting that the Soviet Union didn't have the same successes that we did. It was in many ways the unique combination of free market in America, plus also government intervention and engineering and subsidization and all the rest, that created this very interesting hybrid, which American farming has become. And it's really interesting to see that that is the way things are. So yes, the efficiencies are tremendous and actually have created a tremendous amount of food. But I think also it is true that it required a centralized form of planning and also subsidy in order to encourage it to become what it has. And so there are things there that are, I think, I think America's food system is really interesting because it is a place where often you see liberals and conservatives go different ways in really bizarre ways, because you see them arguing for things on either side that you think, wait a minute, that's, according to your own principles, that's not the way you would normally argue that particular thing. And so I think that that issue, the questions you raise are actually really good ones. I would really love, this is a slightly different plug, but I know you guys are all seniors, so you're past this point, but I'd really love to see people write theses on this very thing. There's a lot here to actually work with in the creation of theses, because the efficiencies question is, I think, a really important one. And I think you're right, Caleb, to ask the question, how do we know what to value? How do we, and that is really, I think there's a tremendous amount of wisdom there. Some people would say, even my point about the education system, they would argue, yeah, this is, doing it online is the most efficient way. This is the best way to do it. It's the cheapest, and all the rest. And of course, there are many people, if you did a lot of online education, if you were in high school and so forth, and I know a lot of students who I personally taught who have done online education, I'm not trying to bash all forms of online education, they were able to do certain things and have certain teachers that they wouldn't have had because of where they lived in the country, right? Where they were. There are certain advantages there. But I think that NSA has rightly said that the kind of education that we do and we value has this core of values that is lost if we just go the realm of online education. It's absolutely true. You all know that. You wouldn't sign up for an NSA that were online. You really are concerned about these. You recognize what I'm saying. But this doesn't just apply in this realm, right? Part of it is understanding the trade-offs and what does it mean to have actually, why is it that we value certain things in the education realm here that are related to this? And learning that lesson and then applying it to other parts of our life. It might be way more efficient for me to hire a governess for educating my kids and taking care of them so that I could devote all of my time to something else. But there are also costs to that, aren't there? And that is really, I think, the key thing that we have to give consideration to when we are making, this is what wisdom and prudence is all about. And I think this is just one of those places where you can really see it. So no worries about, Mariah, about your internet. No problem. You're back again. Good to see you. Okay. Now, I want to make sure we're almost out of time here, but this has been, I think, really, really fantastic. One of the things that he argues in the course of this, in the course of these two chapters, chapter 5 and chapter 6, and if I could just make a plea to you, I've read them earlier when I was earlier before class, this class began, not just this class, but the whole semester. And I went through and reread these chapters 5 and 6, and there was a number of things that I thought was just really fascinating about the way this story in America played out. There's reasons why we valued efficiency coming out and standardization. I think it's really important for our generation to understand that, why it would be that a generation emerging from a great world war and also from a powerful economic depression would value the standardization of products, the ability for them to reach all the way across America, for you to be able to have prolific staples such as the American food system provided. That's, I think, a very important thing to understand. And at the same time, I think it also dramatically changed and made certain things about the American food system to be thought of as kind of just givens in a way that I think is definitely not the case, ought not to be the case. But it's quite interesting to see how they actually played out during the course of our history. And I think it's interesting. I'm curious about that 0.67 number, because I think it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out again. But I think that one of the other things that you end up losing when you have people not engaged in agriculture or in the process of growing things is that you lose people's serious engagement with the world around them in that realm. You have people who are completely checked out of that process and are not able to make the prudential considerations that are essential for the kind of communities that we live in. And not absolutely, but it's really important, I think, to consider those things and to actually be a part of recognizing their importance. And I don't think that's solved by people becoming sort of the food revolutionaries who think that, I'm never going to eat a product that was grown on a conventional farm ever again, and that's how things change. That's not how things change. Not how things change at all. In fact, one of the things that we will get to here in a moment as we go forward in the book is we're going to see how the American food system has changed from 1950 to the 70s, and then from the 70s now to 2000s. And there's some very remarkable things that have dramatically changed about our food culture in America. Some things that are, that it's like what goes around comes around again. But there are some really interesting things that I think we'll have opportunity to observe and note there. So anyway, is there anything else in terms of the two chapters here that I think I was thinking of, chapter 4 and chapter 5, that you wanted to note before we're done with our class today? We're just gathering in here on the last moments. About 5 minutes left. Yes, Luke.
So one of his key, I guess one of his thesis statement, at least to start off with, is the idea of the regional cuisine of America, and that's his main thing. And then as he comes into chapter 4 and 5, page 174, he talks about the unquestioned popularity of industrially produced food for much of the 20th century was accompanied by mass forgetfulness. Mm-hmm. The taste of the past might remain dimly attractive, but it was made to seem unmanageably difficult and time-consuming to achieve in the contemporary fast-paced world. So maybe he'll go on to this, but he seems like what he set off with started off with as American cuisine definition of regional focus. Now going on to is this his point of it now more than mass-produced? What's the word? Sort of, it's all the same. It's all easy to come by. That's sort of his focus now.
Well, so I think particularly in chapters 4 and 5, so the first thing is regionalization. That's the first thing he focuses on, and he gives you a sense of how you have these different regions in the United States, often largely shaped and molded by the kind of local natural products that they have available to them. If they're on the coast, they have coastal products. If they're in the farmlands or in other parts of there's different localities and cultures, as well as ethnic realities that are imported from the various places that our people who come to explore and settle the New World come from. And it's those interesting combination of things, like in New Orleans, for instance, the Creole French influenced by the kind of ingredients and natural products that they have in New Orleans that produces the kind of food that is very unique and distinctive of that region. Now, so that's the first thing he wants to say. That's in our past. But he also shows the way in which regionalization sort of decreased as the rise of industrialization increased. And there is a very interesting sense for why it would be that industrialization homogenized the tastes of Americans, de-emphasizing the regional specialization. And as the food system sort of ramped up, what's the third thing, by the way? So those are the first: regionalization, industrialization, and then
variety. Was it
variety? Yes. And I think that's just a really fascinating combination, industrialization and variety, because it seems those two things are actually at odds with each other, right? Because industrialization rises, it seems it's very, the uniformity of things rises. And then where does variety come in then? Sorry about the crying.
So where does variety come in?
Where does variety come in? Yes. Or how is it compatible with industrialization?
I don't remember.
Well, some of that he's still actually developing. So
He mentioned in the preface, but I'm not sure. I don't remember what he said in the preface about it.
Is the variety the fact that you have several really consistent things you can find? Like you have, maybe variety is limited compared to what it used to be, but you do have 3 kinds of whatever that you will always be there that you can choose from?
Yes, right. So he actually focuses at one point. I can't remember. I think it's a little later in the book. You haven't read it yet, but he talks about how Americans love. Like there's one cookbook of I forget which recipe it was, but there was like 50 different ways to make this one dinner. Right? He said that's distinctively American. You would never find in France 50 ways to make beef bourguignon. I mean, it just doesn't exist. Like, you don't do that in France. There is approved, and there might be some regional variations, but that's not a thing. Like beef bourguignon is what it is. It serves for what it is, and you appreciate it for what it is. Americans have this kind of sense of endless variety. What he says about variety and its relationship to industrialization is that industrialization enabled you to make all these interesting little tweaks, much like if you're familiar with going by McDonald's or Burger King or Arby's as you're driving down the road, and you realize in the course of a year how many new flavors of sandwiches with different tweaks do they come up with every year. It's astounding. Like all the different combinations you think that they could come up with to make. And if you ever go in and have any of these hamburgers, I mean, I'm not trying to knock them because I enjoy a nice Arby's sandwich from time to time, but when you go in and have one of those sandwiches, right, and you taste within the variety of what you get at Arby's or McDonald's, there is a massive solidarity, shall we say, right? A massive solidarity with, yes, some nice, interesting flavor tweaks here, there, and the other place. Industrialization actually learned how to make the appropriate tweaks to keep America's tastes engaged and love to play to Americans' sense of desire for novelty and new flavors and new tastes. And it came by tweaking the ingredients and the so forth of the different things that were produced, which meant that it was actually very possible to have a lot of things that, like if you go to, let's be fair, if you go to the grocery store and you try some of those frozen dinners that are in the freezer area there, that a lot of college students, not you, but a lot of college students tend to sort of live on, right? If you actually taste them, you would be surprised how much they taste alike. Almost regardless of what it is that you get, there is a fundamental kind of solidarity to the product, even despite, like potato chips is another example, right? How many infinite varieties of flavors can we have of potato chips? And we all love the fact that you can have, salt and vinegar, but at the end of the day, they're still potato chips. We just sprinkle different flavors on them, and we have them. That's a great example of this industrialization, which is the ability to mass produce these potato chips and the various different flavors, the variety that we can have as well. So that's, I think, one of the things that we really get here that you need to pay attention to as we head toward the second part of the book. But if you have an opportunity to just review, I think the most important chapters from this first section are chapters 4 and 5. We'll pick up on this theme of industrialization next time on next class, next Monday, and sort of advance it out further and note particularly how science played in this rise of industrialization. It was the scientific age and the scientific way of eating. And that's something that's really also worth fleshing out. There are upsides to that as well as downsides. So we'll look at those next week. All right, so tomorrow then we have our salad course, right? Salad course. I'm excited to see what you all come up with for that, especially those of you that are doing chocolate salads in some variety. I don't remember who Cat's excited. I'm excited to see how chocolate works its way into a salad. All right, that'll be really great. And I have, again, at my house, I have all of your packages, containers from food from the past weeks out there on the porch. So those of you that would like to retrieve those, you are encouraged to do so as you come there. Thanks, guys. So good to see you.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you.
Thank you.
Thank you.